Before we begin, I want to warn you that this story contains mature themes. It deals with the challenges of rebuilding one's life, complex family relationships, and infidelity. If these topics make you uncomfortable, you might want to stop reading now. I stood in my kitchen that morning, letting my fingertips trace the cold edge of the granite countertop. The hum of the refrigerator felt louder than usual. Perhaps it was the quiet or the weight of everything it took to get here, to this modest home in Da Nang, to this new chapter in my life where, for the first time in a long while, things felt steady. At 35, I had long struggled with uncertainty, but now, together with David, my 30-year-old partner, we were slowly finding our footing, moving from cramped apartments and stretching every dollar we had. I remember nights spent on a worn-out couch, staring at bills I couldn't pay and silently hoping David wouldn't notice the worry in my eyes. Even in our early days, David had an uncanny way of understanding me. He would come over, wrap his arms around me, and with a gentle smile reassure me that everything would be okay, and somehow it always was. Before David entered my life, I had known loss and abandonment that left deep scars. I used to wonder if I'd see echoes of my past in a new relationship, but David turned out very different. He never carried the same cold detachment or the urge to escape. Instead, he stayed. Back then, our living space was so limited that secrets were impossible to keep, so we shared everything. Every worry, every joy. I answered all his curious questions, no matter how awkward they sometimes seemed, and he, in turn, confided in me with a refreshing openness. As our relationship matured, our closeness only deepened. While others might have sought distractions outside, David often chose to stay home with me. He loved our quiet evenings filled with simple conversation, playful jokes, and cherished memories of days gone by. I treasured his presence perhaps more than I should have, but it was our way of holding on to hope in difficult times. Maybe that's partly why I threw myself into fitness. It wasn't merely about looking or feeling good. It was about feeling strong enough to face whatever life might bring. I started running every morning, lifting weights, and finally taking care of myself the way I deserved. And it worked. I felt healthier, looked better, and discovered a confidence that inspired me to dream of more than mere survival. With that newfound strength, I bought this house. A light, calm space that was truly ours. I promised myself I wouldn't feel guilty about this small luxury. I deserved it, and so did David. Soon after, I invested in a hot tub. At first, it seemed extravagant, but after all we had endured, it felt like a well-earned reward. I even discussed it with David beforehand, and his warm, encouraging smile made everything seem right. On the first evening the hot tub was ready, I spent a long time simply soaking in its gentle warmth, letting the water ease away the stresses of the day. By the weekend, I was eager to share this new comfort with David. After dinner, I invited him to join me outside. The night was mild and a soft breeze danced through our backyard. I changed into comfortable swimwear and joined David on a cushioned lounge near the hot tub. Relaxed and content, he remarked on how soothing the water felt as the jets massaged away the tension. I laughed softly and agreed. It was a simple pleasure that brightened our evening. We reminisced about old sitcoms we once enjoyed, shared playful moments from our past, and talked about our hopes for the future. The soft murmur of the bubbling water and our gentle conversation created a peaceful, almost meditative atmosphere. As we sat side by side, the quiet closeness between us reminded me of how far we had come. In that calm moment, I felt nothing but gratitude. Gratitude for the strength that had carried me here, for the safe haven of our new home in Da Nang, and for the enduring love between two souls who had found solace in each other. Some kind of power I didn't know I had revealed itself in that moment. "You knew," I said, breaking the silence. "This wouldn't have happened if you just gave me back my seat." David laughed, and though the tension eased for a moment, it never completely disappeared. He slid out of the hot tub, muttering something about needing another drink, and then stepped inside. I watched him go, my eyes drifting lower than they should have, and when he finally disappeared, I let out a shaky breath. What was that? I leaned back against the tub's edge, my body still buzzing. Maybe it was a harmless fluke, or maybe it meant something deeper. I couldn't stop replaying that intimate encounter, the way he had been so close, the look of surprise in his eyes before he quickly looked away. It made me feel incredibly alive. By the time David returned, the moment had passed, yet my thoughts continued to question whether it had been as innocent as I tried to convince myself, or if it hinted at something more. If you've made it this far, thank you for sticking with me. I know this story isn't the easiest to hear, and I truly appreciate you taking the time to listen. If you find this interesting, or if you think someone else might relate, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe. It really helps me keep sharing stories like this and reminds me I'm not alone out here. Now let's get back to it. I told myself it was nothing more than a weird moment, heat, drinks, and too much time in a small tub. But the next morning I found myself replaying it in my head. The way David looked at me, a mix of nervousness, embarrassment, and something else, and the way I felt, giddy, flattered, and undeniably curious. I hadn't planned on teasing him, not at first, but the idea lingered, tempting me. It began in small, subtle ways, wearing a tank top without a bra while making breakfast. He never said a word, yet I caught him stealing a quick, barely perceptible glance that sent a thrill through me. That thrill soon turned into a habit. Leggings replaced my old sweatpants, and I opted for low-cut tops on days I knew he might be watching. I found countless excuses to linger a little longer in his presence, to brush past him just a bit closer than necessary. I told myself it was harmless, a playful game, but the more I indulged it, the more I realized I enjoyed it. By the time Christmas rolled around, the air between us had shifted. There was an undeniable charge, a playful, teasing energy that went beyond outfits and fleeting glances. It was in the jokes, the way David retorted just enough to test how far I would let our game go. "Careful, babe," he teased one night as I leaned over the couch in leggings and a tank top. "You're going to make someone stay." "Oh please," I shot back with a roll of my eyes. "You might think that after all this time I'd be immune to your teasing, but I can still feel every little spark." He delivered his line so casually, as if it were no big deal, but it hit me hard. I felt my stomach flip, and I turned away before he could see the truth in my expression. Later that evening, the hot tub became our private retreat once more. I didn't even have to ask. David grabbed drinks and towels before I could say a word. I changed into a pink bikini, smaller than the one I had worn before, and waited for him outside. When he stepped in, his eyes flicked downward for just a split second, enough to make me smile. "Careful, darling, you're about to lose your balance," he teased, handing me my drink. "Oh, stop." I laughed as I sank into the warm water. "I wouldn't want to see you get hurt." The playful banter hung in the air, heavier than the steam rising off the water. I joked about switching seats again, but he immediately shot it down. "No way," he said with a blush. "Not after what happened last time." "What happened last time?" I pressed, tilting my head in curiosity. His face reddened, and though I teased a bit more about his embarrassment, he quickly brushed it off. Later, when he climbed out and I caught a glimpse of him through his damp shorts, that familiar thrill surged through me all over again. After Christmas, I found yet another excuse to nudge our playful boundaries. A new sauna I had ordered as a treat for our home. David offered to set it up, and I made sure to stay close while he worked. I stood in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame in a crop top and shorts, and watched him tighten screws. "Oh, Mr. Handyman," I teased, trailing my fingers lightly down his arm. "How will I ever repay you?" He laughed it off, but I couldn't help noticing the way his eyes briefly drifted to my legs before he returned to the instructions. I let that moment linger just long enough before stepping back. Once he finished setting up the sauna the next day, I asked if he wanted to try it out with me. He hesitated for a moment, then I said, "Come on, you built it. You should at least enjoy it." That invitation did the trick. I chose an outfit that kept our playful game alive, shorts and a tank top worn without a bra. David arrived in athletic shorts, no shirt, looking more rugged and striking than ever as we squeezed into the snug space of the sauna. Our legs brushed lightly and I felt my pulse quicken. "You've done such a great job in here," I said, leaning back. "Are you sure there isn't anything more I could do?" David grinned. "Well, I do have one little issue that you might just be able to fix." I blinked, taken aback, but before I could reply, he waved it off. "Couldn't. I'm couldn't," I teased. "Oh, I thought our playful banter had cooled down." "Well, you're not the only one who's noticed," he shot back, his eyes flicking to me in a way that sent a shiver through my skin as the fabric of my top clung to me. I pushed my chest forward with a smile. "It's natural after a workout." Then the timer dinged, breaking our moment. David stood up first and I followed, our bodies brushing against one another as we stepped out. "Maybe I'll work out with you next time," he said with a grin. "I'd love that," I replied, though my words felt heavier than usual. That night, I went to bed feeling restless. Part of me longed to return to our familiar routine, while another part was curious to see just how far we could go before drawing a clear line. The shift became undeniable the next morning in the kitchen. I was rinsing dishes in my tank top and shorts after a morning workout when David approached from behind. His hand brushed against my lower back as he reached for a glass, and the gentle pressure told me it wasn't an accident. I froze for a heartbeat, warmth flooding my face, but I didn't pull away. "Your eyes are on me," he remarked with a playful smirk. "Oh, you noticed?" I shot back, striving to keep my voice steady despite the flutter in my heart. Then he hesitated, as if searching for the right words, before softly asking what was acceptable and what wasn't between us. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. He was, in effect, asking for permission, testing the waters. I couldn't pretend any longer that this was all in my head. "Words don't matter," I finally said. "Just say whatever you want. If something crosses a line, we'll just call it a bad joke and move on." I felt relieved but also nervous. I could tell David's mind was racing, so I pushed a little further. "What about touching?" I asked softly. "What are you comfortable with?" He paused, swallowing hard. I'm fine with hands," he managed, locking eyes with me. "But only on my butt, and only if I can do the same." David laughed. A sharp, nervous sound, then nodded. "Deal." I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than an innocent, silly agreement between two people who'd always been close. Yet the moment carried a weight I hadn't expected. My stomach flipped as I turned back to the dishes, pretending not to notice his lingering gaze. It wasn't long before we tested our little pact. Later that night, while loading the dishwasher, I felt his hand brush against my hip, quick but deliberate. I straightened up in surprise and bumped right into him. Instead of backing away, he pressed just enough for me to feel his warmth. I looked up with wide eyes. "Someone's feeling bold," I murmured in a tone lower than I intended. "You said it was okay," David replied, though his face flushed a deep red. I smirked and turned away, yet the heat between us lingered, even after he left to meet friends later that evening. That night I rifled through my closet, pulling out skirts and tops I hadn't worn in years. I wanted him to notice. I wanted to keep pushing our boundaries. The next morning, I came downstairs in one of my shortest skirts and a blouse worn without a bra, with just enough buttons undone to leave something to the imagination. David was already in the kitchen, still in his boxers. When he turned around, his jaw dropped. "Is that for me?" he asked half-jokingly, though his eyes stayed fixed on me. "I figured my outfit should match yours," I teased, stepping a little closer. His grin shifted. He wasn't just joking anymore. As he passed by, he let his hand brush my lower back, and I leaned into it just enough to let him know I liked the touch. In the days that followed, our exchanges became a series of small, lingering touches, meaningful glances, and subtle signals that danced on the edge of what we both knew might be too far. David grew bolder, and so did I. "You're going to get me in trouble," he remarked one night after I bent over to grab something from the floor. "Maybe I want to," I shot back, straightening up and turning to face him. "Careful," he warned, though his tone was less cautious and more excited. By the end of the week, it wasn't just offhand comments or accidental brushes anymore. It was hugs that lasted too long, brushing past each other in the hallways even when there was plenty of space, his hand lingering on my hips as he reached around me for something. Every time, I felt that familiar rush of heat and curiosity that left me wanting more. Even though we'd always laugh it off and pretend nothing had truly changed. I felt relieved but also nervous. I could tell David's mind was racing, so I pushed a little further. "What about touching?" I asked softly. "What are you comfortable with?" He paused, swallowing hard. I'm fine with hands," he managed, meeting my eyes. "But only on my butt, and only if I can do the same." David let out a sharp, nervous laugh and then nodded. "Deal." I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than an innocent, silly agreement between two people who'd always been close, yet the moment felt heavier than that. My stomach flipped as I turned back to the dishes, pretending not to notice his lingering gaze. It wasn't long before we tested our little pact. Later that night, while loading the dishwasher, I felt his hand brush deliberately against my hip. I straightened up in surprise and bumped right into him. Instead of backing away, he pressed just enough that I could feel his warmth. I looked up with wide eyes. "Someone's feeling bold," I murmured, my voice lower than intended. "You said it was okay," David replied, though his face flushed deeply. I smirked and turned away, but the heat between us didn't fade, even after he left to meet up with friends later that evening. That night I rummaged through my closet for skirts and tops I hadn't worn in years. I wanted him to notice. I wanted to keep pushing our boundaries. The next morning, I came downstairs in one of my shortest skirts and a blouse worn without a bra, with just enough buttons undone to leave something to the imagination. David was already in the kitchen, still in his boxers. When he turned around, his jaw dropped. "Is that for me?" he asked half-jokingly, his eyes fixed on me. "I figured my outfit should match yours," I teased, stepping a little closer. His grin shifted, he wasn't just joking anymore. As he passed by, he let his hand brush my lower back, and I leaned into it just enough to let him know I liked it. The next few days unfolded with the same small, lingering touches, meaningful glances, and subtle signals that danced on the edge of what we both knew might be too far. David grew bolder, and so did I. "You're going to get me in trouble," he said one night after I bent over to grab something from the floor. "Maybe I want to," I shot back, straightening up and turning to face him. "Careful," he warned, though his tone was less cautious and more excited. By the end of the week, it wasn't just offhand comments or accidental brushes anymore. It was hugs that lingered too long, brief yet charged touches in the hallways despite the ample space. His hand resting on my hips as he reached around me for something. Every time, I felt that familiar rush of heat and curiosity that left me wanting more. Even though we'd always laugh it off and pretend nothing had happened. Later, as things deepened, I realized we were both scared of what it meant. What it could turn into if we didn't stop. Yet neither of us wanted to stop. "Not yet. I don't know what's happening," David admitted one night as we sat on the couch, pretending to watch TV. "Me neither," I replied, though I added quietly, "but it feels good." He stared at the screen, though not really seeing it. "It does," he murmured. We left it at that, no promises, no decisions, just an unspoken agreement to keep going, to keep teasing, and to see where it would lead. As much as I told myself I'd keep it light, I couldn't help but wonder how long we'd be able to hold back. I hadn't expected that night to change everything. We were in the living room, just the two of us. The TV was on, but neither of us really watched. My legs stretched out across his lap as he absent-mindedly traced circles on my ankle. It wasn't the first time we'd sat like that, but this time felt different. Neither joking nor teasing now, the building tension between us grew thick and heavy, though no words were spoken, until David finally exhaled, breaking the silence. "I don't get it," he said quietly. "Get what?" I asked, though I already sensed his meaning. "I don't understand what's happening, and it's freaking me out." I pulled my legs back and sat up to face him. He wasn't looking at me. His eyes were fixed on the floor, his hands gripping his knees as if trying to steady himself. "You're not the only one," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "I've been trying to figure it out too." He finally looked at me, and there was something raw in his eyes, something that made my stomach twist. "It's not just me, right? I mean, I'm not imagining it." "No," I said firmly. "You're not." We sat in that tense silence again, but now it felt dangerous, as if one wrong word could send everything crashing down. I should have ended it then, laughed it off, changed the subject, but I couldn't. "I feel like I'm losing my mind," he confessed, running a hand through his hair. "Every time I see you, I can't stop thinking about it. About you." My breath caught, and for a second I was speechless. When the words finally tumbled out, they came before I could stop them. "You're not the only one." His eyes brightened, as if he hadn't expected me to say it aloud. I hadn't expected to say it either, but once the truth was out, I couldn't take it back. "I don't know what to do with it," he said, his voice now quieter. "Half the time, I feel like I need to leave the room just to stop thinking about you. And the other half." I knew exactly what he meant. My skin burned, and my heart pounded so hard I was sure he could hear it. I should have told him to stop, that we couldn't keep doing this, but I didn't. "It scares me too," I said instead, hesitating before I added. "But it makes me feel alive." The words hung between us, and for a long moment neither spoke. Then David leaned back, letting his head fall against the couch. God, David, he murmured, dragging his hands down his face before looking at me again. What the hell are we doing? I don't know, I answered honestly. But I don't want to stop. He looked at me as if searching for some kind of permission or reassurance that he wasn't crazy. All I could offer was the truth. We'll keep it light, I said softly. Just like we talked about before. Nothing serious, no expectations. And if it ever goes too far, we stop. He nodded, though I could still see the conflict in his eyes. And if I were honest, I felt it too. I wasn't sure how much longer we could keep pretending it was just playful teasing. But for now I needed this. I needed the way he looked at me, the way he made me feel. I should go to bed, David suddenly said as he stood up, running a hand through his hair. Yeah, I agreed, though neither of us made a move immediately. He lingered for a second longer, as if waiting for me to stop him, but I didn't. When he finally walked away, I was left alone with my thoughts, wondering if what was happening between us was already too far gone. That night, I tossed and turned, replaying our conversation over and over until its edges blurred. Part of me felt relief, as if a weight had been lifted now that everything was out in the open. But another part felt heavier than ever. I'd crossed the line, even if only in my head, and I didn't know how to uncross it. The next morning I found David in the kitchen. He was already dressed, standing at the counter with a cup of coffee. When he looked up as I walked in, for a moment neither of us said anything. There was no tension, not like the night before. Just the quiet intimacy of a new morning. Morning, he said softly. I grabbed a mug and filled it, my mind still echoing with the previous night's confessions, wondering where this uncharted path might lead. Trying to keep my hand steady, I could feel him watching me, and it made my pulse quicken. But this time I didn't let it show. Not this time about last night, he began, but I cut him off. We need to talk, I said, turning to face him as I set my cup down. We also need to be honest with ourselves. He nodded, looking nervous, as if he wasn't sure what I was about to say. Honestly, I wasn't sure either, but we couldn't keep pretending nothing was happening. That much was clear. I can't lose you, I said softly. No matter what, you won't, David replied quickly, stepping closer. But we can't keep doing this, whatever this is. My voice wavered as I pushed on. It's messing with both of us, and I can't let it get to a point where we can't come back from it. So what do we do? He asked, his voice cracking just enough to make my heart ache. We set boundaries, real ones this time, I said, swallowing hard as I forced myself to maintain eye contact. No more touching, no more teasing feelings. And if either of us starts crossing a line, we say something. No brushing it off. He nodded slowly, though I could see the hesitation in his eyes. He didn't want to let go of whatever was between us, and part of me didn't either, but I knew we had to. I reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. I need you to know, I continued. This has nothing to do with how I feel about you. You make me feel alive, seen, and I'll never forget that. But this can't be the way I find that feeling again. I need to figure out what's missing in my life outside of this house. Outside of us. His shoulders relaxed just a little, and for the first time in days, I saw not the man who had been looking at me like I was someone new, but the young man I fell in love with, the one who trusted me, leaned on me, and looked up to me. I get it, he said, squeezing my hand back. I feel the same. I just didn't know how to say it. We'll be okay, I promised, and I meant it. But we need to make sure we keep it that way. David pulled me into a hug, tight and familiar, like all the ones before. But when he pulled away, something felt different, lighter. As if we had finally released the tension that had been tying us up for weeks. Later, after he left to meet some friends, I stood in front of the mirror and really looked at myself. Not just at my body, but at everything. The softness in my eyes, the way my hair fell around my shoulders, the glow of my skin even without makeup. For the first time in years, I felt beautiful and desirable. And it wasn't because of David, not really, it was because he reminded me what it felt like to be noticed. I promised myself then that I wouldn't let that feeling fade. I'd keep it alive through new experiences, new people, and maybe even a new relationship when I was ready, but it wouldn't be through him. It couldn't be. When David came home later that night, we slipped back into our usual dinner, TV, and casual conversation, and for the first time it felt easy again, comfortable, as if we'd found our way back to each other even if we'd lost something along the way. Still, as I lay in bed that night, I couldn't help but wonder, what if we let it go further? What if we crossed that line? And what if the part of me that wanted to know never really went away? I'm not sure where this leaves me, but I know it's complicated. That's why I'm sharing this. Maybe someone out there has an insight I haven't thought of. If you face something like this or know someone who has, I'd really like to hear your thoughts. Sometimes it's hard to see clearly when you're in the middle of it. And if nothing else, let this be a reminder. Loneliness can pull you to places you never expected to go. Pay attention before you cross a line you can't come back from. Thank you for taking the time to listen. Your thoughts matter, so feel free to share them.